Hello and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. My name is Gail, and my guests today have come all the way from Florida. So that's going to be pretty interesting. They are a nephew of ours, Geoffrey Steiner Jr., and his girlfriend, Lexi, wait a minute here, Lexi Vegafria, did I pronounce it right?
Vegafria.
Vegafria,
Yeah.
Lexi Vegafria, okay. And they are here from Florida, and well, I think this is going to be pretty interesting. Now I'm going to have Lexi first describe to you what her education is and,
Sure.
and what she's going to be doing.
Sure. So right now I'm a law student. So I graduated in December of 2019 from the University of Tampa. I got a degree in political science and philosophy and a minor in law, justice, and advocacy. So I was already on a pre-law track. In August of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, I began law school at Loyola University in New Orleans. A year later, I ended up transferring to the University of Miami, where I'm now a third-year law student, and I will be graduating in May. I'll take the Florida bar in July, and then I will be sworn in as an attorney, hopefully sometime in the fall.
Okay. Geoffrey, tell us about your education.
I have a bachelor's degree from the University of South Florida. I studied philosophy and English. I had a concentration in creative writing.
Oh, good, good. Okay, now, it's kind of an interesting story how the two of you met. Why don't you two mention that to the viewing audience?
Sure. You can tell it.
Yeah, we met at a call center called CapTel, and they do phone captioning for the hearing impaired. She was at UT at the time, and I had just graduated from USF.
Yeah.
And you were both working there, so you were working together, and that's how you met.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, Lexi, what kind of law are you going to be practicing?
So I will be practicing housing law, specifically landlord-tenant law. So I was recently hired as a staff attorney to begin in September, representing tenants in Florida. I work at a nonprofit called Legal Services of Greater Miami, and we represent low-income people and families who are finding themselves in housing issues.
Okay, and you, Geoffrey, what kind of work do you do?
So I work at a law firm based in Florida that handles asbestos cases. So they litigate in the court system, and they also are involved in bankruptcy trusts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Lexi, you've already been doing some work in the type of law that you're going to be practicing,
Mhm.
and are you able to mention, without mentioning names, of course,
Sure.
the story that you told me about the 88-year-old lady?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things we do is we help low-income people. A lot of them are also subsidized tenants, so public housing, Section 8, stuff like that. And one of the cases we're working on, she's facing an eviction because her landlord has said that her unit is almost like a hoarding house, which is considered a lease violation. And so after looking at the house, I visited the house, I visited with her. It's not as dirty as the landlord would like us to believe. So right now we're in the middle of hopefully negotiating and looking to settle the issue. But the problem is that once an eviction lawsuit is taken out against someone in Florida, the eviction stays on the record forever. So even if a tenant in Florida wins their eviction case, a lot of harmful effects can still affect them just because the lawsuit was taken out against them.
So they can actually evict an 88-year-old person and make them homeless.
They can, yeah. So the landlord-tenant laws in Florida are very landlord-friendly. Tenants don't have many protections in Florida, which is why what we do is really important. And so the law is not an equalizer. They don't really take into account, the standards of each tenant. It's just if you have the money, or if you don't have the money, if you did it or you didn't. So
I have a lot of trouble picturing an 88-year-old person as being in good enough shape to have to live out on the street.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a very troubling thought too, and it's 88-year-old women, it's disabled women, it's women, children, sometimes very young children. Sometimes they can go to a homeless shelter. Sometimes there's not room at homeless shelters. So it's a very troubling thing to work through and to understand the effects of. And so a lot of what we try to do to talk to landlords is to really let them think about, well, this is what they're going to have to do if you do evict them.
So they're just out of luck if the landlord succeeds at evicting them, and sometimes apparently the landlords make stuff up.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, that can be the case, and that's why it's really important to have representation to make sure that tenants aren't being taken advantage of by the landlord. So representation for especially low-income tenants is really, really important because a lot of people don't know their rights. And so that's also one of the missions of legal services, is to make sure that people know their rights and that their rights are being protected, because there's not many in the first place.
Now, Geoffrey, with this asbestos now, these people from the asbestos side of it, somehow you help people who've been exposed to asbestos. And I know that we were talking about this last night, and you said a lot of people who've been exposed get cancer, but in a small amount of cases, they don't. So do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical expert. I have a very layperson's understanding of how things work, but from the late 1890s up until about 1982, asbestos was ubiquitously used in a number of products. Not everyone exposed becomes ill. The vast majority, unfortunately, do. And so for most folks that worked with it, they develop an illness called asbestosis. Asbestosis. And it's sort of an umbrella term. It can get specific the way in which it affects the lungs. But generally, asbestos fibers, it's a fibrous mineral. Once it's inside the human body, we can't rid ourselves of it. And whether we're talking about inhalation into the lungs or ingestion through the digestive system, it typically causes problems. And it's more so a matter of when and not if. And so for the lungs in particular, when the fibers get inside, the body's response is developing scar tissue. And typically the scar tissue builds and builds and builds over years or decades. And if it gets to a certain point, it impacts their ability to breathe. And then there are some folks, they're looking at the possibility of lung cancer. They're looking at the possibility of mesothelioma, which is the cancer of the lining of the lungs. As far as the digestive tract, there's a number of cancers that can develop, whether we're talking about cancers of the mouth, cancers of the throat, the stomach, the colon, rectal cancer. So it can be a double whammy. Some folks, they might have asbestosis for a number of years, and eventually they could develop some form of cancer.
I know there's laws nowadays, like if a building's going to be torn down, it has to be tested to see if there's asbestos in the building before they can do that. And then they probably have to wear hazmat suits, don't they, to do that?
Yes, so asbestos abatement is something that still goes on today. Fairly, I'm fairly confident, you know, any building prior to the 1980s, there's some sort of asbestos that was used in the construction, whether it was in the drywall, the insulation, the electrical wiring, and once the general public came to know about some of the health hazards, there are very stringent regulations that are now in place as far as the abatement is concerned. So folks are wearing respirators, they're wearing protective gear to keep themselves safe.
Yeah. Now, Lexi, this place where you're going to be working as an attorney, and you've already been hired. You know, we didn't think to have Chris scan that picture so we could show you and your coworkers there. But do you want to talk about
Sure.
about the staff at that law office?
Sure, yeah. So I, right now, I intern at Legal Services of Greater Miami. So this is actually my 3rd semester interning with them. So I have a few months under my belt working with tenants' rights. And at my law school, they have what's called a clinic, where students are chosen to work in different areas of law. So I'm in tenants' rights clinic, but we also have like bankruptcy clinic or human rights clinic, stuff like that. And each of these students are essentially treated like an attorney, where we have our own cases, and our supervising attorney will just watch over us, make sure everything's going well. But essentially, we're being treated like the point person. If there's a hearing, we argue it. If there's a motion, we write it, stuff like that. And so it's really good hands-on training before being put into the real world. And so through that clinic and working at Legal Services of Greater Miami for so long, I interviewed with them for a full-time attorney position, and I work there. And that office has been wonderful. I work with a lot of fantastic housing attorneys, all who share the passion of making sure that tenants' rights are established and protected and known. And so they've got some really great leaders in that office that are, I think, molding the next generation of housing attorneys.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that, but it's a good thing that you're doing. I'm glad you're passionate about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, Geoffrey, how did you get your job at this law office?
I got really lucky. So I spent some time working in dental insurance after I graduated, and there was a application on Indeed at a law firm, and I was considering maybe applying to law school, and I figured it might behoove me to work at a firm to sort of see how it works with the nuts and bolts before making a decision about that. And the firm ended up really, they really liked my background studying philosophy.
Oh,
that was
okay.
that was a big component of why they interviewed me, and it went well, and I just got really lucky. You know, it was sort of a timing thing more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, you seem like a very empathetic person, you know, that really cares about the people that you're helping, and Lexi does too. So,
Yeah.
did you say you had to travel quite a bit when you first got the job?
I traveled a little bit when I first started. About 6 months in, I had to outsource a few things for the firm, and that involved traveling to meet with folks, you know, in person. I think you can get a better feel for someone face to face than over the phone or over a Zoom meeting. But yeah, a big reason why the firm itself jumped out at me was the fact that they work with these asbestos, these folks that are dealing with these asbestos-related illnesses. That was a really important thing for me. You know, working to help other people, trying to make someone else's life easier. Yeah,
that's pretty terrible. Now, you've got really old houses that were built before the asbestos. Sometimes you find a house that needs to be torn down, and you have it tested for asbestos first, and come to find out there isn't any. Like maybe ones that were built way like in maybe 1860 or something like that.
Well, we don't work much with abatement exposure, so the removal after it's been put in place. There are a lot of homes still around, built before it became so prevalent, but you know, oftentimes when a new homeowner, you know, buys a new property, they're probably going to do some sort of renovations. So I'm sure there are a number of older homes that over the years, in the mid-20th century, they had remodels done or new additions added. There's a lot of construction as far as some of our clients having worked in those industries, so that's very common. But as far as abatement, it's not as common as far as the clientele that we work for.
Yeah, I guess New York State has a very large amount of buildings that are way over 100 years old, more than most other states, from what I've heard. So, okay, Lexi. Tell us something about the homeless situation in Florida.
So Florida has, you know, a prevalent homeless situation. I think a lot of states right now are experiencing it. One thing contributing to the homeless situation is just how stringent the landlord-tenant laws are. So tenants could find themselves homeless or having to, you know, go couch surfing or just finding themselves in shelters and stuff like that. And that's because, or a large reason is because the landlord-tenant laws are so stringent against them. So we have a statute in Florida, and this is, I believe that Florida is the only state that has this. It's called a pay-to-play system. So Florida Statute 8360 requires that when a tenant is sued, they have to pay whatever rent money they owe into the court registry before they're allowed to have their day in court. So if you're being sued for not paying your rent for 2 months, if your rent is $2,000 a month, you're behind $4,000. You have 5 days to put up $4,000 into the court registry, and if you don't, you're just immediately evicted. You're not heard by a judge, you're not heard by anyone. Even if you have a meritorious case, tenants just get default judgments and they're thrown out.
Yeah, you know, I think the rent is probably a lot higher in Florida than it is in New York State, because I've known various different people that are paying like $500
For rent?
for rent for an apartment. Yeah.
Oh, that's
a bargain price.
That's a very bargain price, yeah.
Compared to Florida.
Yeah, so Miami specifically was recently dubbed the most unaffordable city in the United States.
Was it really?
It really was. So
I didn't know that.
A lot of our subsidized tenants, their base rents are $2,000.
And that doesn't include electricity and all that?
It could. It depends on who it is, but the landlord will charge $2,000, and if they get some kind of subsidy from the government, they're required to pay a portion of that $2,000, but the landlord's base rent is $2,000. Most one-bedroom studio apartments are going for about 17 to 22, I've heard. And
17 to 2,200.
Yes, yeah, just for rent, not including
not including utilities.
No, nothing like that. And then you also have to pay like your let's see, your utilities, parking garage,
There's a parking garage fee.
Somewhere, always.
Okay.
You can never park for free in Miami.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah, so, and Miami-Dade is a ginormous county. So my firm, because of how big Miami-Dade County is, we only service 2 counties in Florida. So just Miami-Dade and then all of the Keys.
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, so that's the
Yeah.
only people that we can service, just because both are so large. Yeah.
Have you ever found yourself, well, maybe you haven't yet, do lawyers find themselves in positions where they're helping people whose homes have been damaged by hurricanes, because you get hurricanes down there?
Yeah.
What's that like when you?
So I mean, when it's damaged by a hurricane, it's harder to negotiate with the landlord about evicting them, whether or not they should, or whether or not they should fix it because it was caused by natural occurrences. What are more common cases for us is the landlord just doesn't maintain the conditions of the home. So that's a reason where we as the tenant can actually sue the landlord to pay for damages because they fail to maintain the conditions of the home. And as a landlord, even if your tenant is not paying rent, you still have to maintain the conditions of your home because of things like asbestos, because of things like mold, and because Florida is very rainy. When it rains, mold can happen naturally. So
and it gets really muggy down there, right?
Right. And so I'm in the middle of a case right now where we're suing the landlord because of unkept conditions, and she doesn't have anywhere to go. So the landlord is more like, well, why don't you just leave? But she doesn't have anywhere else to go. So she has to take these really bad conditions because there's nowhere else for her
There's
to
nowhere
be.
else for her to go, yeah.
Yeah, sadly, a client of ours phoned us a few weeks ago, a gentleman living in Florida, and he is looking for advice because his landlord hasn't fixed an elevator that was damaged during the hurricane season last fall.
Oh, okay.
And it's sort of outside of our wheelhouse. The legal field, I often think of it like construction. So you're not going to hire a plumber to fix your wiring issue in your home, and so we handle asbestos cases. The best we can really do is try to refer him to a firm that would be able to
help
provide
him.
assistance.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah. It's too bad to see so many people without a home.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah. What else would you like to tell us about working at this law firm?
I think that legal services and legal aid is a very important institution in our country. I think that the people that we service are very often overlooked. A lot of the time, these low-income people and families are really trying to do their best, trying to make rent, trying to provide for their family, but also as a human, you also want to enjoy your life. And so people get upset when, they're like, oh, well, go get a job. Like, just go get a job. And people don't really realize how hard it is to be able to do that, because to be able to get a job, you have to have an address. Well, if you're homeless,
you don't have an address.
Right. So maybe you can stay at the shelter, but the shelter isn't a permanent address. And so
no, it isn't.
Right. So there's so many barriers that I think that people don't realize that low-income people and sometimes homeless people face before they're able to really stabilize themselves. And so eviction is really a vicious cycle of poverty and, trying to get help, and no one will help you. And so a lot of what we do in legal services is we are the ear that they're trying to get someone to listen to, and we can use our stance in the court to make sure that they feel heard and to make sure that they can finally have someone who will look out for them and who will take care of them to the best of our ability. And so if it's our small little piece that can help bring some solace in their life, then that's what we're going to try to do.
Do you speak other languages besides English?
I don't, no.
You don't?
I speak...
I was wondering about that because, it seems like there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people in the United States nowadays. And I just wondered about that.
Yeah, especially in Miami-Dade. So I have recently downloaded Duolingo. I don't know if you know what that is.
I think I've heard of something. There's something on National Public Radio that they call Babbel. It's where you can get online lessons or something.
Maybe, yeah.
To learn some foreign languages.
Yeah.
But
so Duolingo is about the same concept. It's an app where you practice, a different language every day. So when I officially signed on to be an attorney in Miami, Miami is a very heavily Spanish-speaking area where the default language there is Spanish. So we're kind of at a disadvantage only speaking English. And so I thought that when we realized we were going to stay there indefinitely, it would behoove me to learn Spanish to be a better advocate for clients, because sometimes tenants will come to us and they don't speak English. And so if I want to provide the best representation and the best form of advocacy, then I should be able to learn and understand and communicate with them better. So I'm working on it, but not just yet.
Some people who are going to be watching this are probably wondering what nationality you actually are. Would you like to tell them?
Sure, yeah. So I am half Laotian. My mom is from Laos. My mom was born and raised in Laos, and she came to the United States when she was about 10. My dad is from Guam. He was born and raised in Guam, and they both met in the military in Germany. So my dad left the island when he was about 17. My mom also joined the Army around that time, and they met overseas, and then they moved back to Guam, and then to Washington, and then we moved several other times, just being a military family.
Now, Geoffrey, would you like to describe how you're related to me and my husband?
Oh yeah, of course. So my aunt's husband Carl is my mother's oldest brother.
Right. Unfortunately, they lost a sibling in recent months, so that's been kind of a sad thing for them. Well, you lost your dad last year too.
Yeah. But sometimes loss brings people closer together. So
sometimes it does. Yeah, it really does. So let's get into your job a little bit more now, Geoffrey. Do you speak other languages?
I had 8 years-ish of Spanish in,
Did you?
In public school.
Oh.
I can't speak a lick of it.
He tries. He does try.
I do. I put my best foot forward. There's a quote I really love. I can't tell you who it's by, but the gist is, speak in my mother tongue, you speak to my heart. Speak in a second language, you speak to my brain. So even for some of her clients, even if they're bilingual, oftentimes things go better when you speak to their heart. You speak in their own language. But as far as my job, we have clients nationwide. We do have some clients that primarily speak Spanish. Folks in Texas, folks in Florida, folks in New Mexico. So that can be common. But thankfully, we haven't run into many issues as far as a language barrier is concerned.
Well, one of the people, one woman that lives in our neighborhood, actually grew up in Spain.
Oh.
And I was surprised when I found that out, because I'd known her quite a while. And I had never noticed her as having a Spanish accent. And so I asked her about that one time, and I say, it's funny that you grew up in Spain, but you don't seem to have an accent. And she goes, well, I try not to, but I can. But she must be pretty good with the English if she can speak it without a Spanish accent. Sometimes you can just tell where somebody's from by their accent.
Yeah, sometimes it's apparent. I made a friend in college who moved to the UK, only been there maybe 2 or 3 years before his sort of natural accent switched. So if you hear him talk now, you'd think he's from England. But
Well, my sister spent a year working in Canada one time when she was a lot younger. And when she came back, she had like a Canadian accent for a while, but it went away, you know, after she'd been back for a while. But she pronounced out, oot, and things like that. But Geoffrey, you've had to make a couple of trips to Washington, D.C. for your job. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so COVID was a big impact to the work that we do. I mean, almost every federal agency was sort of shut down, or they functioned in a diminished capacity. And we work with a very wide variety of clients. Folks who worked in the construction industry, folks who worked aboard ships, folks who worked in automotive or production or upkeep. And sometimes, depending on the case, it might be necessary that we provide corroborative information. So one key piece might be a Social Security earnings report, which sort of details every job that someone's had where they were paying into Social Security. And I had to take a trip to meet with some folks in DC to sort of see, you know, is there a way that that our clients might be prioritized due to the circumstances of their illness or that sort of thing.
Okay, so you said you do some work with clients in bankruptcy cases?
Yes. So essentially, the big history of asbestos, it was sort of a miracle material when it first started being used after the Industrial Revolution.
They didn't know it was toxic.
Well,
or maybe they did.
It's interesting. So there's a key figure from history, Pliny the Elder. He was a Roman historian.
Oh, that was in ancient times,
This was a
wasn't it?
long
I've
time
heard
ago.
that name.
Yeah, we're roughly talking 2,000 or so years ago. And back then, he wrote about something they dubbed as slaves' consumption.
Slaves' consumption?
Slaves' consumption. And so back then, they weren't really scientists, they were natural philosophers.
Okay.
But there were some folks who made a connection between slaves mining this material out of the ground and having this illness. Strangely enough, years and years later, tuberculosis was referred to as consumption.
Oh, okay.
And the Romans, they would weave cloth with asbestos.
Oh my gosh.
Tablecloths, napkins, and after a feast, they would throw the material onto a fire, and the grease and gristle would burn away, but the cloth would remain intact and be as white as it once was.
Oh my gosh.
So that was sort of lost to history. And after the Industrial Revolution, asbestos was used in a number of materials. And
insulation?
Insulation
like
was a very common one, electrical wiring. A lot of companies produce siding, like for houses, made with asbestos. And it was even used in materials that didn't need the insulation properties afforded to it by asbestos.
Oh, really?
It was almost as it was almost used as a filler material to keep some costs down. So, you know, residential oven mitts, you don't really need something to protect you from something 900 plus degrees, but it would be included in those types of products.
Oh gosh.
And I can't really speak to exactly when some of the companies knew, but there was an internal memo that was written. It was from a VP to a board member of a nationally known company back in the 1930s, and the gist of it was these guys made a living working with asbestos. Why not die from it? So a lot of the companies that were involved in either manufacturing products that contained asbestos or manufacturing products that required asbestos for it to be used properly. Boilers or furnaces are a good example of that.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
But many of the companies, they put profits before people for decades, and they knew that the folks working either on the manufacturing side or the installation side or the renovation upkeep side, these companies, they really couldn't care less about the folks that were going to be exposed. And this became public knowledge in the 1970s or so.
Oh, okay.
So lawsuits were filed against a number of companies. Sometimes it was just one claimant against the company. Other times it was a class action suit where a number of individuals would come together to sue an entity. And a lot of the companies involved, they went through this bankruptcy process. It was dubbed the Texas two-step.
The Texas two-step.
The Texas two-step. And there was an interesting case that just came out a few weeks ago about that.
From the Third Circuit.
From the Third Circuit.
But yeah, so what
and
happened was...
she can speak to that a little more than I can.
What happened was, because he didn't really understand like how bankruptcy got involved. But when the claimants filed these lawsuits back in the 70s, these companies were eventually found to be liable for the asbestos and the injuries and stuff like that. And so because asbestosis takes so long to develop in the lungs, they were required to set up trusts that would fund future plaintiffs who may or may not come forward. And so that's kind of how his firm got involved, is that they will like try and work with these trusts that were created because as a consequence of these companies filing bankruptcy.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can talk about that because of being a law student. You can talk about that aspect of Geoffrey's job,
so
right?
She has a better understanding overall of how bankruptcy proceeds. But as far as the Texas two-step, there's a few states that allow companies to sort of restructure in this way. I believe Delaware is another. But you'll have a parent company who was sued for negligence. And in the court system, they found them to be liable. And a lot of the companies, they struggled paying out so many settlements, so many court costs, attorney fees. They would establish a sub-company. And in this subset, they would pump all of the liabilities, all the debt the company has. The parent company would retain their assets, and this new shell company would then declare bankruptcy. And it was literally created to declare bankruptcy and go through that process.
The company was created to go through
the shell company.
The shell company.
The shell company.
Yeah. So for example, John's...
Are you talking about the shell company?
No, not the oil
not
company.
that.
No.
Okay.
A shell company as in like an empty entity.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
so-
Just a pretend company.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for example, Johns Manville is a company that went through this. They're still in business, but they essentially set up a subset entity connected to their own company, which then declared bankruptcy after accepting all the liabilities from Johns Manville at that time. And so for some companies, they were able to go through that process and still remain solvent in business. Other companies that wasn't the case for, but in circa 2018, there was roughly $40 billion in these various asbestos trusts, bankruptcy trusts.
Oh my gosh,
So
$40 billion.
There's a
Oh my
lot.
gosh.
There's a lot of settlement value there for claimants, and a big issue with the asbestos thing is a lot of guys are sick, and yes, the companies were forced to create a bankruptcy trust to pay them out, and there is a latency for the illness. It takes time to manifest, but there was no requirement that these companies or trusts make it known to the potential claimants that it's available for them. So that's a whole issue in itself.
So I think a commonality between both of our practices is that a lot of our prospective clients and a lot of their prospective claimants, they don't know that help is out there. And so that's a big hurdle that we both face, is that if we can get to the people, then we can try to help. But if they don't know about us, then they're battling these things on their own. You have claimants who are sick and they don't know why, and I have tenants who might have a good case, but if they don't know about us as a resource, then they're just left on their own. So.
Yeah. Well, tell me about a patient, for example, that does file for bankruptcy because of their illness. Can they wind up having trouble getting health insurance later? How does that work?
We don't work per se with the bankruptcy process. I think you can speak to it.
Yeah, as far as our clients declaring bankruptcy, it's not really something here or there as far as the work that we do. As far as my job, the way in which bankruptcy comes into play was the fact that the companies who made the products our clients used, those are the companies that went through that bankruptcy process.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And that's why
Okay.
there are trusts available for them to pursue some kind of
okay.
recourse with.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of our clients, there are folks that are on Medicare or Medicaid. The demographic that we work with, right now, some of the oldest clients we work with were born in the 1930s.
Okay.
So they sort of were in their late teens and in their 20s in the 1950s. And the sort of youngest folks that we work with are guys that were in the workforce in the 1970s. Because the response from the government after these lawsuits in the 1970s was a heavy curb in the use of asbestos right around 1982. So prior to that date, it was used in everything from sewing machines to submarines.
Oh, gosh.
After that, it was only allowed in instances where it absolutely required it. So furnaces, boilers, steam systems, steam turbines, steam engines. And there were OSHA regulations in place where if folks were working with that stuff, they had to have been provided the equipment to keep themselves
The
safe.
respirators and the hazmat clothing.
Yeah, the same equipment used, the same equipment folks used during the abatement process.
Well, a lot of people just casually use things like, this isn't asbestos, but like Roundup and things like that, on their lawns and like that. And well, actually, your mother bought a book for me. She sent it to me after she'd heard me mention on one episode of Fresh Perspectives that I'd like to read this certain book one time, and it's called The World According to Monsanto. And technically, you see these people out in their everyday clothing using Roundup and things like that. And technically, according to this book, actually, if somebody's going to use it, they should be wearing respirators and hazmat outfits.
Yeah.
So
the firm I work for, we get a lot of calls about Roundup. There was some recent chatter about lawsuits against the company. And a lot of toxic substances. We get interest about Agent Orange exposure from veterans, but Monsanto is that's a whole story in itself. I know there's been a big issue as far as farmers using some of their seeds, right? The proprietary seeds that they're not able to.
They're genetically modified.
Yeah,
They're genetically modified so that so that they won't get killed when the
From-
farmers
yeah,
are
from the-
using the Roundup
Yep.
on their to kill the weeds growing around their plants.
And then after they
So-
harvest, there aren't seeds from that from those
seeds,
crops to grow.
they aren't any
Yeah,
good.
so you have to buy new
You
seeds
have
from
to buy
Monsanto
more,
year
so,
after year.
so the company gets to make more money
Yeah.
off of the farmers by selling the seeds. Yeah, yeah. It amazes me the things that people do to make money that harms other people, isn't it? I mean,
It's a tale as old as time, unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately.
Another commonality in our two areas of law.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of our habitability conditions are just that the landlord doesn't want to fix the unit, but they want your rent money, so they're not going to cause a ruckus with the tenant unless the tenant stops paying rent. And then there's an argument of, well, I'm not paying rent until you fix the hole in my ceiling. And the landlord goes, well, I'm not fixing the hole in your ceiling until you pay me rent. And so that's the kind of
But the landlords in a lot of cases probably don't want to want to fix the things that are wrong. So if the tenant gives them the money, then oh gosh,
yeah. So
then they're getting ripped off. And
right, yeah. So and then that's how Statute 8360 works, though, is that if you stop paying rent, the landlord can move to evict you, and then because Florida's a pay-to-play state, if you don't put that money in the court registry, or you don't file what's called a motion to determine rent in Florida, you're not getting your day in court. And so usually people don't have thousands of dollars to be able to put up in 5 days if they're not paying rent.
If they're not paying rent, it means they can't afford to pay those other fees.
Right, and so a lot of tenants don't know that if you don't pay money into the court registry, you have to file this motion. But they don't know about this motion that they could write, and you can do it as an individual, but average people don't know that. And so it's just another way that Florida is a very landlord-friendly state and not tenants, because the Florida Supreme Court, they have pre-written forms for landlords to use if they want to evict people, but they don't have the equivalent for a tenant. So the Florida Supreme Court will give landlords the forms they need to be able to evict a tenant, but nothing for the tenant. No guidance, no resources for the tenant, just the landlord.
And there's quite a few problems then with the low-income housing.
There is, yeah. So they face a lot of battles, just from regular daily life, going through eviction proceedings, having to talk to attorneys, having to talk to landlords. It's all very intimidating, while also still having to be a regular human, having to put dinner on the table, make sure their kids are going to school, pay the bills, pay the utilities, stuff like that. So a lot of low-income people are facing a lot of battles that people just don't realize.
Do you have a welfare system in Florida then?
Yeah. We have a welfare system. A lot of our tenants are on it in one way or another. Some of our tenants aren't. Some of our tenants are just facing a landlord who just doesn't want them.
Well, if somebody resides in a homeless shelter, what is that like for them?
I'm sure it's very degrading. I'm sure it's very hard to not, because you can only stay in a homeless shelter for so many days, and then you have to move somewhere else, whether that's a street or go couch surfing.
And then you have what they call tent communities.
Yeah, tent city.
Tent city.
Yeah, I think that's like a very colloquial term. Is that the right word?
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's a pervasive issue in this country. Whether you're talking about Washington D.C. or San Francisco,
New Orleans, we saw a lot.
New Orleans when we lived there. Yeah, I had the opportunity to volunteer with a VA hospital in Tampa while I was in high school. It ended up helping me receive a scholarship to go to college. But
Wow.
I worked with a Vietnam era veteran, and he was in their vocational rehabilitation program. So this is sort of at the intersection of the homelessness issue, where the VA was taking in homeless veterans, and they entered into this vocational rehab program. So they provided them with 6 months of housing, a 6-month stint at some job related to the hospital. So the gentleman I worked with, he and I worked in the prosthetics department. So we would build wheelchairs and walkers, and we would deliver custom prostheses to veterans in the hospital. But it's sort of like putting a Band-Aid on a cut jugular, this vocational rehabilitation program, because after the 6-month period, they're put right back out on the streets. They have lost their job opportunity with the VA. You know, their goal, and I don't know if this is an ongoing program, but this was about 10 years ago or so. You know, at the time, their hopes was within that 6-month period they would be able to find a permanent job, permanent housing, but for many of the veterans it wasn't the case. And you know, there's a huge problem these days with homelessness that affects veterans.
I've heard that. I've heard that there's a lot of trouble with veterans being homeless. And that would be really hard, you know, if the person has a disability, or,
Even
you
more
know,
so.
that maybe is caused by having been in the service.
Yeah.
So,
Time is a really big factor on how you strategize litigation. Like, what are your priorities if it's just time? So like you were saying, it's just a Band-Aid. A lot of what we can do for tenants is just negotiate more time, and that's really all we can do. In Florida, you're only, the state of Florida standard is that if you want to terminate a month-to-month residency, or tenancy, sorry, you have to give 15 days notice. So the landlord has to give 15 days, and that's it. Just for you to be like, hey, pack up, get out. And that's it. It's not a lot of time to find a new place to live, especially if you have kids, especially if you have disabilities, especially if like 2 weeks from today, just, you know, that's a very wild thought to think about. And so sometimes if all we can do is just negotiate, like, give us 30 days, give us 60 days, you know, then that's what we're racing against. Miami-Dade, in the last year or so, just passed a county ordinance that requires landlords to give 60 days notice.
2 months.
2 months, yeah. So it's easier to find a new place to live in 2 months, but it's still not.
It's still not a great amount of time, is it?
No.
Because, I mean, if a person who can afford to, like, buy a house, sometimes they get taken around by
A realtor.
the realtor,
Right,
and to see houses. I mean, it can take a lot longer
take a
than
long
2
time.
months to find a house that's right for you.
I think it took us about that long when we moved. We
Yeah.
worked with realtors for months before we found a place to move into, and that's us being able to afford a realtor and be able to afford to move to go and visit these places to look at it and stuff like that. So,
Being able to get time off work, and
Yeah.
so-
yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah. Okay, we've got like 3 minutes and 46 seconds left. What else do you guys want the viewing audience to know? There's probably plenty.
Yeah,
isn't
well,
there?
I would say anyone who was a blue-collar worker before the 1980s, if you get short of breath walking out to the mailbox or going up a flight of stairs, it might not be COPD, it might not be emphysema. You might want to contact a law firm in your area that handles occupational illness-related cases. You know, asbestosis is just one. Black lung was a big impact
that
to
was
coal,
a coal miners.
to coal miners.
Yeah, I think there's some sort of a lung problem you can get from working in cotton fields.
Could be.
I think so.
Could be.
I think.
I know folks that worked with sandblasting equipment. They can develop something called silicosis. It's just as it's just as an impediment to their lives as asbestosis can be.
Somebody that I know was telling me one time that she wanted to whiten up the white painted woodwork in her house, you know, around the doorways and things. And she spent a whole day with a bottle of Clorox and a toothbrush without a respirator or anything, and caused herself to have a lung injury. So talcum powder is another thing.
Yeah, Johnson & Johnson, that's
Talcum powder is, there's something about that that's similar to asbestos somehow. Do you know how that is?
Yeah, so that was actually the third circuit thing we mentioned earlier about the Texas two-step. It surrounds Johnson & Johnson. And so there was concern that some of the baby powder that they were selling, talc in itself is not a health concern, but it's when talc might be contaminated by other things, namely asbestos. And so there were instances of women who grew up to develop ovarian cancer after baby powder was used when they were young.
When they were babies.
Yeah, so it's not the talc itself.
People have been using baby powder on their babies
for decades.
Forever, you know. So, but I've heard that there have been problems as a result of it.
Yeah. So Johnson & Johnson, they actually tried to go through that Texas two-step process through the bankruptcy, but in the court system they didn't allow that to happen. So
didn't they?
Yeah, but there are a lot of folks that have been affected and awarded settlement values, and they're sort of waiting to see what happens with that.
Do any people with that problem come to your law office, or doesn't your law office?
We had one case. It was a woman who developed mesothelioma, and there was some kind of connection there with contaminated talc powder.
Okay.
Yeah, very pervasive.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for appearing on Fresh Perspectives.
Thank you.
And I hope that the viewing audience has actually learned something helpful. And I hope maybe the next time you come up from Florida, we can do another episode somehow on Fresh Perspectives.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Oh, you're welcome.
There's a wonderful book that gives a fresh perspective on evictions and stuff like that. It's called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. It was done in
Matthew Desmond?
Yes, And so it's a wonderful look into the life of what it's like. It takes the lives of a few different people, but that is, if anyone would be interested in learning about what it is like, that book is wonderful. But
good. That's a good resource.
Yeah, it is a fantastic resource. But thank you.
We've come to the end. You're welcome. We've come to the end of another episode of Fresh Perspectives, and I'll see those of you in the viewing audience when I do the next episode.